Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. My name is Pandan and we're listening to the Fire Emblem Premium Arrange soundtrack while watching the Nintendo Treehouse Live footage from last year. And today we're going to talk about Fire Emblem Three House's map design and why I think it's bad. So we're going to be covering a couple different things today, but I'm going to be tying it all back to map design and why I don't think it's that great. So I think FE16 is emblematic of modern FE's problems. That's not to say other games don't have this problem, but I think it's the most pronounced in this game. And when making this video and thinking about it, I looked kind of back to where did the map's quality start to sort of notably deteriorate. And every Fire Emblem game has good maps, it has bad maps. Some games have more good maps than others, some games have more bad maps than others. I would say the games that started to have more consistently less of a map design focus really coincides with the dawn of one of my least favorite features, reclassing. So if you recall, Fire Emblems 1 through 10, there's no reclassing. You get your unit, they're going to be in a certain class, they have these strengths, they have these weaknesses, they can only use these weapons, and that's it. You'll probably get, 35 to 50 of them that are all a little bit different, and you kind of figure out how to use them in each run. Your top 15 or so. FE11 and FE12, the remakes of FEs 1 and 3 respectively, introduced this reclassing feature, which allowed you to take someone like Gordon, who's an archer, and turn him into a cavalier to make him a little bit better. Or turn Jagan into a Draco Knight, which is a really popular strat. So these games, I don't think reclassing was as broken in them because of the general difficulty with the Vord formula being very punishing, and it was very easy to get hit, but also there were limitations on how many of each unit type you could have at any given point in time throughout the game, so you couldn't run an army of all wyverns, for example. So it kind of added some semblance of balance to it, but not a lot. FE13 Awakening, they introduced second seals and children units, as well as skills. So the game, not introducing skills, but the game rewarded you more actively for changing your unit's class and for figuring out different skills to use so that you could pass them on to your children. So that was really a much more essential mechanic to the game. It was much more core to the element of its design. The way the level curve was kind of lent itself to second sealing to get more levels and new skills so that you can go and progress through the game. It became a much more essential component of Fire Emblem's design. And it made it a lot harder for those maps, I think, to adequately prepare for each type of unit type you would use. And there were certain classes that had skills that everyone wants, like Gale Force. Everyone wants Gale Force. So how do I get there? FE14 kind of continued with this trend with some different takes on it. I'd say FE14 does a little bit of a better job with it. I also think Conquest specifically is just quite a bit more difficult overall, but it still had a lot of the same issues that Awakening had with it. FE15 had reclassing, but it was very limited, so it's not really as noticeable and pretty easy to ignore if you're playing it straight. I think only the Dreadfighter class can just have that loop where they go back to being a villager or whatever, and those DLC spoons, which you can just ignore if you're not buying the DLC. But Fire Emblem 16, Three Houses, they leaned so heavily into reclassing, and that kind of blew everything open with this and kind of made a lot of the problems that have been simmering and that some people in the community have been calling out really out in the forefront for me and for, I think, a lot of other fans as well. The core mechanic of Fire Emblem 16 is that your units all start out as the same kind of base generic villager class, and they can all become any single class, which is a lot. There's a lot of different classes you can pick, a lot of different paths to take, and the other thing that kind of breaks this is that you don't have such limited resources to get there. You can really just infinitely grind. And Echoes and Gaiden had this too, but the class options you could move into were a little bit more limited. And the way the maps were designed made it so that no one class was so incredibly superior besides Dreadfighter for just its raw combat. But FE16, anyone could be anything. So all of your characters are Cliff, basically. So why is this bad? I know a lot of people like reclassing. They think it's fun. They think it enables a lot of customization. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit why I disagree with that sentiment. But I think it's bad because when you have reclassing and any unit can be any class, it makes it so that developers have a harder time balancing a map. Now, if I'm a developer and I'm making a map and I'm trying to craft a challenge for the player, I need to know what resources you have. I need to know the skills you have at that time, the unit mix, their average strength, so that I can figure out how do I place enemies, what level do I make them, what items should they be wielding, etc. This is going to help ensure that I create an experience that is challenging, fair, and fun for the player. Early game Fire Emblem tends to be a little bit better at this because they know exactly what you need. Like, I think it's probably easier to design an early game because your options are so limited, and so it makes it easier for a developer to think through, here's the map, I know exactly how you can approach it, or exactly what tools you have to approach the map, and so I'll try and come up with things that you can creatively try to dismantle with those tools. I think later game FE tends to struggle because of more options, but Three Houses has this problem all the way because there are so many options. For me as a developer, how can I adequately prepare a challenge for the player if I don't know what they're going to have? I'm going in totally blind. And actually, the developers put at the disadvantage in making the map because they're putting the map out, and then you can actually just change your class to suit the challenge. Here's a map with a bunch of choke points, and it's scary to kind of wade through, or it has a swamp or whatever. Oh, you're just going to make a bunch of flyers, okay, and you're going to kind of skip the map. Oh, you're going to give this unit warp really early into the game and skip the map. Okay, like you can win that way. And so when you don't know what the player is going to have, it's hard to account for the right challenge to give them. And Three Houses, I think, really suffers for this, where I feel like a lot of the maps don't intend you to play a certain way. And maybe like if you work to go with like canon classes or to play without grinding, it might be a little bit better. But the game is so easily broken by just like reclassing everyone to Wyvern and focusing on those things. And the game very easily gives you and encourages you to like go for additional battles for more stats, to grind in the greenhouse for more items to give units for stats, tutoring for weapon rank and things like that. There's a lot of things that Three Houses does to make it so that it's easier to optimize your units as you see fit. And what this generally leads to is like everyone being the same, which I'll get to later. But yeah, so I just think Three Houses really leans heavily into this customization piece, and that makes the maps harder to design adequately. Now, like if you're curious, like, well, what are some good examples of like maps being designed for what the player has? I mean, I think look at some of the older games. Like I look at Chapter 12 in FE7, Birds of a Feather, where Hector and Ellie would meet up, and that chapter is a route. It has a mountain kind of cutting through the middle and a lot of terrain. If you had a flyer, you could just kind of navigate through the map very easily, but you don't. So you have to kind of deal with this terrain and like fight the enemies as they come to you using the choke points. And that's like an essential part of the map's design, is using the terrain, using the choke points to try and kind of stave off this attack while the boss charges you. But like imagine if you could reclass Marcus into a Wyvern and with his busted stats charge into the boss immediately and just kind of take all the enemies on at once. Like that would completely break the design of the map. And that's kind of what Three Houses enables the player to do quite easily, is just like, oh, I'm just going to, turn Byleth into a Wyvern and charge in because no one can hurt him. Because the game wasn't designed for me to do this. So it kind of mitigates a lot of the challenge by giving too many tools to the player. It's one of the reasons, again, like why I don't really love randomizers. So just kind of going through my notes here. And even then, like with the class design, right? You don't really have a lot of drawbacks for going towards a certain class. Like there aren't really a lot of like slaying weapons in Three Houses, I would say overall. At least when I played hard mode. Dismounting is really busted, so you can mitigate a lot of that too, because you can dismount and move and dismount and attack on the same turn. So it's just very simple to kind of break the game that way and mitigate any of the drawbacks. So it's like, why not take them out? And so again, it just kind of breaks the map design, because me as a developer, I can't plan for what you have. When there's so many different permutations, there's only so much I can do to make sure that I can make something that's challenging for the player, that's ruthlessly optimizing, and like the casual who doesn't know what they're doing. The older games, I think, had less of this problem because the range of variance was much lower. And this kind of brings me to my next point, about customization and kind of what this means for replayability. So I think the more modern Fire Emblem games lean on customization as a way to drive replayability and kind of promote, like, you can pick any class you want to be. You can do whatever you want, and that'll create all of this infinite replay value because you can pick and choose which classes to use for every map and every playthrough. And that's true to an extent. You know, I can do different runs where I'm like all armor knights, or where I'm using everyone as an axe cavalier or something fun like that. And there's merit to that. But the customization all occurs at the character level. So when you're trying to play like optimally or efficiently, which is how I like to play to a certain extent. I'm not like an LTCer by any stretch of the imagination, but I like to kind of play the game fast, and I like to use, the best options that are given to me to try and dismantle the challenges as quickly as possible. Three Houses makes that very easy. But the biggest paradigm shift that kind of came with reclassing was, instead of customization at the army level, you had customization now at the character level, which is a nuanced but pretty major difference. So let me just unpack that a little bit more. In the older games where you have units without reclassing, it's like Walt is an archer. Walt's going to do these things that are emblematic of an archer. He's got a bow, he's got 2 range, he occasionally gets 3 range, he gets ballistas. These are his stats, this is what he can do. He's a tool in my toolkit to use in specific instances that I have to plan for and that I can choose to use if I want. Whether I choose to use him or not is a choice that I can make when I'm customizing the overall design of my army. Do I want an archer for this map, or do I want a fighter? Do I want a nomad? Do I want an armor knight? And that's going to depend predominantly on the different traits that they bring to the table, but also their strengths and weaknesses. So in like a well-balanced game, these should have like fairly equal trade-offs depending on like the nature of the map. Like, I don't want to bring an armor knight to a desert map because they have low movement, so I'll probably bring a mage instead, for example. I'll bring a thief to like a castle map with chests to unlock things, right? And I'll be switching back and forth between these different characters to do that. The game has this design in mind, it knows the tools I have, and gives me opportunities to use different tools. Customization at the army level. Newer games, they focus on customization at the character level. And this is really predominantly around reclassing. So like Fire Emblem Three Houses has a really small cast relative to some of the other games. If you're playing a route straight and not going through like the really grindy recruitment requirements, you're probably getting like no more than like 20 units in a playthrough, which is very low compared to historical games. So when you're customizing at the individual level, you're trying to figure out, well, how do I turn Raphael here into a Wyvern Knight in this chapter where a Wyvern Knight makes sense? Or do I want to make him a Sage in this chapter where it makes sense, right? And on paper, that might make sense too, right? Like, okay, like this unit has good stats. What if I could use them in different ways? And I think the DS games kind of did this well because it's easy to flip back and forth between them with limitations like weapon ranks and things like that. But this game, because there's no limitation on how much you can reclass into a certain thing, it just leads to optimizing to a certain thing that's the best. Awakening had this issue too, where it's like everyone wants to be a Dark Flyer for Gale Force and Magic. It's really busted. Three Houses, everyone wants to be a Wyvern because axes are really good. You can get Death Blow, which is really good, and you have high movement, high strength. You can do a lot of damage. And so, although the game promises me customization, it's so easy to optimize into these classes that are so significantly better than my other options, it just breaks the map. And it actually makes characters feel more samey, and to me makes it less replayable, because I have fewer different options to try. It's like, I know that like if I do Golden Deer again, I'm going to have the same units. I'm not really going to have a lot of flexibility on who I use. I have flexibility on how I choose to use them in different classes, but then I'm also very intentionally neutering myself or going against like what they might naturally be good at. Like when I played the first time, I made Ignatz a bow knight because he had, proclivity towards bows, and it was kind of like a natural place for him to go. Like I can try using Ignatz as an armor knight, but it might not make sense, and it might be more trouble than it's actually worth to do. I have to go out of my way to make him bad, Versus like in an old game, if I want to use an armor, it's like, peace, I'll try Wendy out. And it's like, I know that she's going to be bad, but at least like I don't have to put in any effort for her to be bad. I have to go out of my way in 3 houses to make a unit worse than they actually could be, in my opinion. So it makes kind of all the characters feel samey. And like it got to a point where I kind of forgot like who was who, and it was just like, oh, I have my Wyvern squad, and they're just gonna kind of run train on everyone. So again, replayability of maps is really big for me. I like going back to games and trying them again with different army compositions. But 3 houses, the way you go about making your army composition is at the character level, not the army level. And so instead of like picking different units that come with certain sets of skills that I can use, I have to go out of my way to give them a certain set of skills, which is the same amount of effort as making them good, in my opinion, generally. So kind of my closing thesis on this is that the more Fire Emblem leans into customization of their characters, the worse off the map design is, because it just kind of breaks open the game a little too much. If I can be whoever I want, whenever I want, it's going to make maps a lot easier to break versus, maybe in old games where I could just like feed stat boosters to break stuff or like funnel kills into a single unit. 3 Houses kind of actively encourages that, in my opinion, with the way its class system and structure is designed. If I have to put the same amount of effort into making someone into a bad class versus a Wyvern, I'll probably just make them into a Wyvern because it's the same amount of effort. So that's kind of my main issue with 3 Houses map design, is how reclassing breaks it. We could talk a little bit about like Maddening mode and some of the things that it does there that I don't like. There are 2 things that I don't like about Maddening mode, and this is kind of more like a larger design piece in general. One, everyone knows it, ambush spawns. They're bad. Ambush spawns encourage trial and error, and it's clear that the developers very much intended for trial and error gameplay because they give you Divine Pulse, or IS-sanctioned save states, as I like to call it. It's like, the design is very much based on like, you're going to get surprised, you're going to get ambushed, you're going to get stuck into these positions, but it's okay, we can let you rewind to try again. And while it's like a nice insurance feature to have that, I also don't think it's a good thing to design your games and maps around, because it just kind of turns it into RNG fest. It turns it into turtling to see like when ambushes will come. And that's true of any game with ambush spawns, not just 3 Houses. I have this issue with FE6. I have this issue with Awakening. It's a problem with any game with ambush spawns, is that it just encourages turtling and more trial and error oriented gameplay. The other thing that I think is a little bit more unique to 3 Houses and its enemy and map design is the amount of speed the enemies have, especially on Maddening mode. Speed is a really tricky stat to get right, because it affects so many different things. It affects their avoid, it affects their ability to W, and it also affects their ability to not get doubled. When speed is really high, it makes enemies harder to hit and also more likely to W. This is really a problem when not balanced well, especially in the early game of Maddening, where almost all of your units are getting doubled and they're dying in 2 or 3 hits. What this does is it creates very enemy phase-oriented gameplay. That's really, in my opinion, not very exciting. I think that enemy phase is at its best when it's really about positioning to take on a few different enemies so that you mitigate the amount of damage that's done to any one unit. I think enemy phase is bad 2 things. One, when you could just like park someone with a hand axe in a forest and just kind of grind through like 8 enemies at once. But I also think it's bad when you're in combat up close and you want to defeat a unit, but you can't attack them without worrying about the counter, and so in more cases than not, you just want to wait so that they attack you first, then you attack, and then you can heal on player phase to prevent yourself from dying on the enemy phase. In some cases, that strategic thinking makes sense. Like I think boss battles, that makes sense that you might want to like sponge a hit first if they're gonna like 2-shot you. But when all the generic enemies can like 1-round you or close to 1-round you, and you want to do multiple things at once, it kind of just slows everything down because you just want to use your player face to heal and then try and whittle the enemy down that way. And I think early game Maddening mode does that to an extent. Smaller issue as well with Maddening mode is that all of your units start with 4 movement, and the maps are like clearly like not well designed for 4 move units. That's a problem with all of 3 Houses. Like the McClellan map, my god is it slow, because you're just like traipsing along with like mostly 4 move units at that point. and it makes it kind of a slog to play because you just can't get around very well at all. And that's a shame. It just kind of slows everything down. I think 4 move in general is just too low for Fire Emblem unless your maps are super, super tiny. But I think 4 move just prevents you from even doing like simple things like wrap around an enemy to attack. It just limits you so greatly. I just don't think it's good. I think 5 is like the bare minimum you should ever try doing in most cases. That's not to say you can't make it work, but the way a lot of FE maps are designed, I think it's a lot trickier to make that happen. So that's why I think Three Houses map design isn't great. I know I rambled on quite a bit. This video's been going on for 20 minutes. I do want to give credit where credit is due and say that, again, I had fun when I played Three Houses. The first playthrough was really fun. I enjoyed the character writing. The monastery was a fun novelty for a little bit. It's a really nice game to look at and listen to. But on further inspection and on replay playthroughs, there's a lot that I'm like, I don't want to do this again. And that's a problem. There are some maps that have some good side objectives. I think they did a good job of trying to pepper more of these in, especially in the paralogs. I thought a lot of the paralogs like had pretty good design intent. Like the one with like the Dusker guys that you want to beat before the enemy gets there. As well as like some of the other maps where different enemies show up depending on like where you move. Or just different side objectives in general, like protecting villages and like the anti-turtle, like in the, I think it's the Tomas map. That was in a paralog, but you get my point. It does a lot more to make the maps more interesting than like routing enemies in a field, which some of the earlier maps feel like. And maybe I'm not giving Three Houses enough credit. Maybe I would have more fun if I artificially challenged myself by using weaker classes or weaker units. But if it's easy to make my units so good, I'm just going to make them good. And maybe that's on me, but it shouldn't be on me to make my own challenge. The game should find a way to be challenging for its own merits. But maybe I'm in the minority there. I don't know. I'm curious what you all think. And I want to hear your opinions on this. Maybe this isn't the hottest take out there, but I just wanted to like kind of make my thoughts on this. This game became a little bit more about reclassing, but Fire Emblem Three Houses, the way it does reclassing, directly impacts the map design. All in all, it comes back to maps. I think the other thing, lastly, that would help Three Houses a lot is if it actually just freaking made its own maps. Like, there's so many reused maps. There's just so little emphasis on maps in this game. It's sad. But, nevertheless, I'm curious what y'all think. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is just how I feel about it. I hope I've made some coherent thoughts here. And I'll see you guys next time. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I definitely would like to hear them. And we'll take it from there. Thanks, guys. Be safe.